Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Peterson Institute for hosting and inviting me to speak, and of course thank the Doris Duke Foundation for supporting this partnership. So my presentation will mostly focus on sort of the political and policy aspects of addressing carbon leakage from energy-intensive and trade-exposed industries in the context of climate legislation. And so I'll go through first some political history of the issue on Capitol Hill, some of the recent research and analysis that's shed some light on this complicated issue. I'll go through some of the nuts and bolts of the bill that just passed on Capitol out of the House side, the Werksman-Markey legislation, discussing in particular the output-based rebate provision that was developed by Congressman Inslee and Mike Doyle and with the Energy and Commerce Committee, and also the International Reserve Allowance Program developed by the Ways and Means Committee. And so these are sort of the two pieces of the legislation that kind of work together to address this issue. I'll try to wrap it up with some discussion about some expectations for what we can expect from the Senate in the fall. So there's a pretty long history of competitiveness in climate policy with respect to the U.S. and I guess you could say internationally as well. Certainly in any country that decides to move forward with domestic climate policy has to wrestle with this issue. Certainly the EU has had to deal with it. Australia, New Zealand, any country that's going to move forward with their own domestic climate policy absent an international agreement. And even with international agreement, we'll have to deal with this really critical policy issue. It has significance with respect to the environmental implications, economic implications, and clearly political implications in terms of the jobs and competitiveness that can be lost domestically when you place a price on carbon. So I'd say probably the first public and most well-known initial incidence of this issue on Capitol Hill was in July 1997, the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which passed out of the Senate unanimously, 95-0, essentially in the context of the Kyoto negotiations, and the Senate sent a clear signal saying we aren't going to support any legislation that doesn't require comparable action, a measure of comparable action by all countries in the world, including developing countries, and that was sort of an initial line in the sand, and I think the Senate has certainly held to that so far in the discussions and debates. Early in 2007, the American Electric Power and International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers proposed a solution to this issue that was this International Reserve Allowance Program, an early form of it, which was designed to be WTO compliant, and the idea was for any imports to the U.S. that come from countries that haven't taken a measure of comparable action to the U.S. on climate policy, they would have to purchase allowances at the border from a separate international reserve pool of allowances outside of the cap. It was designed and touted by the drafters as I said, being WTO compliant and also as a means to protect industry from this concern of carbon leakage. It was also touted, I think, by proponents and certainly some within the labor community as a means to compel action by other countries, those countries on whom these duties would be levied at the border, or these taxes would be levied at the border. In, I guess, last spring, previously, 2008, when the Lieberman-Warner bill was on its way to the floor, never got enough votes for cloture to formally begin debate on the floor. There was a letter from 10 Democrats, the so-called Gang of 10, essentially opposing the bill for a few different reasons, one of which was, of course, this issue of competitiveness and the potential for carbon leakage and a competitive disadvantage as a result of the bill. That bill did include this AEP-IBEW proposal. It also included a substantial amount of free allowances to industry, so a high economic essentially incentive to maintain production domestically. But because of perhaps the way they were designed, there just wasn't really buy-in from industry or labor, and so that was that chapter. In the following fall, last fall, Congressman Inslee and Mike Doyle introduced a bill that was really designed as an amendment to a bill like Lieberman-Warner that was addressed with respect to the rebates, the allowances, to protect energy-intensive industries from this exposure to leakage. And that bill was reintroduced at the beginning of this Congress earlier this year and folded into the Waxman-Markey bill that passed out of the House. So that just said, it's hard to, I think, overstate the political significance of this issue. It's absolutely critical, clearly, to getting a bill passed through the Senate to address this issue to the satisfaction of the labor community, the industry, and environmental community, and honestly the international community as well, because not only do we need to get a bill through committee, it needs to include provisions that work, that are effective, and are designed in such a way that we can still garner support from our international trading partners for them to take some measure of comparable action. So some of the research and analysis that's been done in recent years on this has really helped, I think, shed some light and change the debate, really, on this issue. The book I show up here, Leveling the Carbon Playing Field, was a World Resources Institute, Peterson Institute effort, and that was last spring. There were also some papers from Resources for the Future, one of which was published by the Pew Center. There was a German Marshall Fund policy paper that came out in July, actually, which I think was very good, looking at these issues. There was a GAO report, which I don't list on here, that came out this spring. And then some of these papers draw on the extensive analysis and experience of these sort of policies for energy-intensive trade-exposed industries, how they're treated in Europe and in other countries that are developing similar proposals. And there's been extensive literature and analysis in Europe as well. From all of this, I think there are several take-home messages. I can't take too much time on this, but I think first of all, it's clear that the best policy solution is some international agreement or set of agreements that recognize the disparities that can occur when you have a climate policy, disparities in carbon pricing, and the international competitiveness effects of that, and potential carbon leakage effects of that. But clearly, reaching an agreement, international agreement on this, is going to take some time. We're not going to get there right away, certainly not in Copenhagen, and so any domestic policy needs to include interim measures. I think most people are recognizing now, from industry to labor, environmental community, and the international community, that as a first measure, allowance allocation to these industries through a well-designed set of provisions is probably our best way to address this. And then further down the road, and of course those allowances are targeted toward those industries that are specifically vulnerable. And then further down the road, there's the potential for border measures as well. And if those fail, and if the allowances fail, then you have, I think, the border measures as a backstop. And that's the basic structure that most people agree could be an effective set of tools. The other point I was going to make is just that, of course, as a result of this research and experience in Europe, we're not walking into this legislative discussion blind. There's a good amount of information to work with, so that's obviously fortunate. Okay, so in the bill, as I already noted, there are really two integrated provisions, the Waxman-Markey bill. There's an allowance rebate program, which I'll also be referring to as the output-based rebate program, or OBR. Essentially, it provides temporary allowance rebates, guaranteed through 2025, and then phasing out through 2036, conditional on certain, depending on certain conditions. And those, of course, are for these specific industries, and provide allowances on the basis of production, of output of product, as opposed to past emissions or some other metric. This is combined with and integrated with an international reserve allowance program, which essentially is a border adjustment or border taxes similar, essentially, an international reserve allowance as originally envisioned in the IBEW AEP proposal, which would start in 2020 on imports of international imports from countries that have not taken comparable measure of action. So I think an advantage to this bill versus previous efforts to address this legislatively is really how well these two provisions are integrated, and I think that the fact that both of them are designed to phase out and go away when essentially they're no longer needed, and there's a level of detail that I won't be going into, and probably the bill could be clearer on, but that's the Senate, of course, is working on this actively. One other thing actually I'll mention here is that there are a number of other provisions in the bill. Nobody really expects these provisions to compel other countries to take action to reduce their emissions. The other provisions in the bill that are designed to do that would include clean tech financing, adaptation assistance, international offsets, international reduction of emissions from forestry, and some of these being conditional on, there's conditional access to these funds depending on actions by other countries, which is really all designed to leverage developing countries to take some measure of action. So while people often point to these border measures as a means to compel other countries to take comparable action, most people don't believe that they'll actually effectively achieve that. So really there's more focus on these other measures in the bill to achieve that. Okay, so I'm going to go briefly through the policy design of the allowance allocation to industry, the output-based rebates. So first of all, there's the question of why would you allocate allowances to industry? President Obama, of course, called for 100% auction or a rapid transition to that in climate legislation. There are really two reasons that you would. One would be to compensate for investments in stranded assets and protect shareholders. And the second would be to prevent carbon leakage. And the second, of course, is what this provision, the rebates, are designed to do. Next question is, which industry should be eligible for free allowances? In the context of carbon leakage, clearly you want to target those that have high energy inputs and those that are trade exposed and exposed to the potential for carbon leakage. So you do really want to target it, and that's an important part of the policy design. And in the next slide, I'll show you how we do that just briefly in the bill. And forgive me if I lapse into we. I worked for 3 years for Congressman Inslee and on Capitol Hill. So now, of course, just as of 2 weeks ago, I moved to WRI. So I get trapped in that sometimes. So the next question is, on what basis do you give allowances to industry? Do you do it on the basis of past emissions, level of employment, or in this case, output of production? The consensus is sort of built around the output of production approach, at least here in the U.S., because previous proposals had flaws that we couldn't get essentially industry, labor, and environmental groups to agree would be effective in achieving our goals. If you provide allowances on the basis of past emissions, there's a windfall profits potential there and a problem where industry will take the allowances, say thank you very much, we're still going to move over, relocate or reduce our production and lay off a bunch of workers and decide to produce elsewhere where there is no carbon price. Not pointing fingers, just sort of a reality of how you might operate business when you're giving out allowances. If you do allocation on the basis of production, there's clearly an incentive to continue to produce domestically, and the way that it's structured, there's actually also a built-in performance incentive. So essentially there's a reward for those facilities that are more efficient and who've made investments in efficiency, and there's a reward for those who choose to invest in efficiency improvements at their facilities moving forward. So it seems to send the right signal to industry. It's consistent with the overall objective of a climate policy, and labor, of course, is supportive of this approach because it helps improve. As these efficiency improvements are made, these industries become more efficient and more competitive internationally, and of course these jobs are retained. And the emissions are not going elsewhere, which would of course undermine the policy. That's the carbon leakage problem. So the final question is, at what point should allowance allocation be phased down or replaced by another policy mechanism? And of course, the simple answer is when a carbon price disparity is reduced or eliminated, and the bill is essentially the bill is designed to do that after 2026. That actually is delayed through 2026 in the House bill. Earlier discussion draft and the bill that Inslee and Doyle introduced had a mechanism where if other countries took action, and in the earlier years, some point before 2026, there was an opportunity for these sort of compensation mechanisms to phase out at an earlier time. And I think certainly folks in the Senate are looking at that as a possible thing to get back in the bill moving forward. Again, just want to reiterate, of course, the best solution is if we can all reach some international agreement or agreements in an international framework to address this issue. This is just to put one nice color figure up here for you. This is Trevor Hauser put this together. This is a figure that some of you may be familiar with. It's rather busy. I won't go into all the details on it, but this is essentially how we determine energy-intensive trade exposed in the bill based on two criteria. One is the energy intensity of the sector, and that's on the bottom on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis is the trade intensity. And so you can plot, and on all the size of the circles on the plot are proportional to the amount of emissions, total emissions from the sector. So iron and steel is the big red circle. Aluminum off to the right, very energy intensive and trade intensive. And so you draw a line in the legislation at 15% trade intensive and 5% energy intensive. And any sector that meets those two criteria is considered to be vulnerable to carbon leakage. This figure doesn't show another metric that was added later on in the process. If you're more than 20% energy intensive, regardless of how trade intensive you are, you could also be eligible, and that essentially captures lime. I think that was all I was going to point out. I think just mainly I would also note that you can see certainly from the size of these circles that qualify and those that don't, that we're capturing about half of industry as eligible for these rebates, and the other half would not be because they're either not energy intensive enough or not trade intensive enough. The International Reserve Allowance Program, which is, as I noted, would apply to imports from countries that have not taken a measure of comparable action. So here, they would. So this would start in 2020, unless, and there's sort of a series of the way it's structured. I'll try to walk you through the structure here, and we can come back later to other details if people have questions. But basically, the first step is there are a series of negotiating objectives in the legislation, and if those negotiating objectives are met with respect to the international community and all sectors concerned, then imports would not be subject to the requirement of these allowances. And really those sectors that would be subject to it would be the same sectors that qualify for the rebates, so really targeting the same set of sectors. Now, if the negotiating objectives are not met, then there would be essentially each sector and or each country that does not meet certain set of standards would be subject to these international reserve allowances. And I guess I won't go into the details of that. I think we could probably come back to it because I'm a little short on time. But it's this, of course, is where you get into questions of WTO compliance, and I think the next two speakers will speak more about these provisions, and we can come back to it. I'm sure a lot of you are interested for me to get to this part, so I'll wrap up with this. So the dynamics in the Senate and what can we expect in the Senate in the fall. So of course, passing the bill in the House builds some momentum. The bill passed out with a substantial amount of support from industry and labor. Certainly not all of the trade-exposed, energy-intensive industries were were on board and supportive of the bill as it moved out of the House, but certainly there were a number that were: Dow, DuPont, Alcoa, Rio Tinto. Most major organized labor associations were supportive. And another interesting note on as it passed out of the House was the debate really on this issue in the House was different than it had been historically. There was a lot more focus on the allowance provisions in the bill, less focus on these the mechanisms at the border. I think it's come to be recognized that the allowance provisions are more central and important, effective mechanism for preventing carbon leakage. However, certainly the International Reserve Allowance provisions remain a political point of debate and contention. And as the bill moved out of Energy and Commerce Committee to the floor, Ways and Means submitted some language the language that was first floated, and some of which was leaked to the press, drew a lot of fire from the administration, a lot of folks in the environmental community. I got a lot of calls from embassies. People were very concerned about it. It definitely changed substantially before it went to the floor to a more of a compromised position. But of course, once the bill passed, President Obama praised the bill, but had raised a flag about those provisions in particular. So moving forward, Environment and Public Works, Barbara Boxer's committee is expected to mark up a bill first. The expectation is it'll be something similar to what passed out of the House. It's not clear which provisions will be as passed out of committee and which provisions will be as passed out of on the floor, but we're looking at Titles 3 and 4 of the bill, not the earlier titles related to energy. The members of the Gang of 10 who wrote that letter in the Senate a couple years ago, or last year, I should say, it's Gang of X now, there are more members, are actively engaged. They've recently sent letters to the President and to Carol Browner requesting more engagement and more, more engagement and more support for the provisions that are necessary to protect these industries. And the gang is also working on legislation similar to Inslee Doyle, but more expansive. That would include the border measures. It would include, some other mechanisms that would help gain industry and labor support. So Senator Brown is leading up that effort. And then of course, the Finance Committee is another committee with key jurisdiction over some aspects, certainly the trade aspects of the bill. The chairman, Baucus, has a very different view on the border measures than a lot of the Gang of X, so it's not clear. Somehow there's going to have to be some compromise, some middle ground. Maybe it's similar to what passed out of the House. Obviously, we can't tell right now, but the expectation is that he'll be marking. Certainly his staff is working on this right now. We know that for sure. But he's focused almost entirely on health care, so that process is delayed a little bit. Possibly even through till the end of this year. I think the Environment and Public Works Committee could have legislation public by the end of this month, I'd say at the earliest. By the middle of next month, there could be some committee markup. I'd say that's probably at the earliest. But other than that, it's really difficult to get a sense of timeline just yet. But I think generally the senators who are engaged on this, certainly I know the Gang of X is eager to have input from the administration in many regards. And if you look at the letters led by Senator Brown and Senator Bayh, you see evidence of that. And I'll end my talk there. Sorry I skipped quickly through the border measures section. I can go back to it later if there are questions.
Well, thank you very much, both to the organizers and to the sponsors of the event. I'm going to speak rather quickly. I'm afraid I have to catch a train, so when you see me running out the door after my presentation, it's not because I'm not happy to field questions. It's just that I won't be able to be here to field those questions. My contribution to this project and to this research has been to try to bring a more international perspective. Although I'm based on the Hill at WRI, I spend more of my time, fortunately and unfortunately, in Bangkok and Barcelona and Bonn with the international climate change negotiators. So I'm trying to give a sense of how the international community is reacting to these provisions that are contained in the Waxman-Markey bill that deal both with the expectations that Congress seems to be settling on in terms of what it wants from an international agreement, but also in terms of what the U.S. will do if it doesn't get an international agreement on climate change that meets its standards. The first set of analysis that we did was very much around the concept of comparability that featured in previous drafts of U.S. legislation that essentially set up the U.S. administration to put in place incentives that would look at ways of incentivizing other countries to follow suit in terms of adopting legislation that was comparable to what the U.S. was moving towards, to respond to the kind of competitiveness concerns that James just outlined, and also to prevent this phenomenon of carbon leakage, of ensuring that U.S. industries that are carbon intensive don't simply move overseas in order to avoid U.S. legislation. What we found was that this concept of comparability was certainly highly contested, both in the international negotiations on climate change, but also within the WTO jurisprudence. But nonetheless, we concluded that neither the climate change treaty, as it currently exists, nor the WTO regime prevented a party from using unilateral trade measures to combat climate change. And, however, that the parties or the members to both regimes would certainly have a view on the legitimacy of the policy purposes that might lie behind that trade measure, whether that measure was accurately tailored to that policy purpose, and finally, whether, if its purpose was to address some sort of imbalance between what the U.S. was doing and what its trading partners were doing, what the reasonable standard for assessing that balance should be. That both WTO members and parties to the Climate Change Convention, bringing those two perspectives on this issue, would certainly have views on what the reasonable standard of comparability might look like. And essentially what we identified was a potential jurisdictional train wreck between the UNFCCC, which is trying to establish these principles or standards of comparability, and the WTO dispute settlement process, which would ultimately have the compulsory jurisdiction to take up an issue should the U.S. put in place a standard, a measure based on its own standard of comparability against one of its trading partners. What we were trying to do with this analysis was essentially to avoid the negative impact, both on the international climate change negotiations, but also more broadly in terms of U.S. trade relations with its trading partners, from a circumstance in which the United States would negotiate an international agreement on climate change, in which all parties put forward what they felt they could do to achieve the global objective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but the U.S. would retain unilaterally the right to impose a trade sanction against a party to that agreement that was in full compliance with that agreement. And we felt setting up that expectation would have the capacity to do significant damage to the international negotiations, as well as to the U.S.'s trading relationships with other countries. Now, Waxman-Markey actually doesn't use the term comparable at all. In fact, it shifts to setting the goal of the international dimensions of U.S. climate policy to setting up what the U.S. refers to as an international agreement that contains commitments that show that all countries are contributing equitably to the reduction of GHG emissions. Given the highly normative and subjective meaning of the term equitable, this is probably best seen in the legislation as a piece of rhetoric. It's very difficult to either expect U.S. Congress to define equitable in a way that, for example, could take into account the different positions of a Chinese peasant farmer and an unemployed U.S. steel worker. We don't expect the U.S. to bring that kind of global perspective to its definition of equitable, but also not something that you could expect other countries to greet warmly, the fact that the U.S. is now seeking to define unilaterally what might be equitable. Border measures, the focus of what I and Gary will be addressing, included in Waxman-Markey, are intended to contribute to this goal of an equitable agreement by, first of all, inducing what the bill refers to as fast-growing developing countries to take substantial action, and also, should that fail, by using these kinds of border measures to prevent leakage. In other words, to penalize those countries that don't take actions that the U.S. perceives as equitable from its perspective. So we get some sense from two provisions in this bill as to what it is that the U.S. wants from international negotiations and what it is that it will do if it doesn't get what it wants. And that is essentially what the rest of the international community is most interested in in terms of this legislation. You can distill two kind of negotiating scenarios from Waxman-Markey. First is that the U.S. is able to achieve a high standard multilateral international agreement that meets its criteria of what equitable means. The other is that it fails to do so, and that we move instead to a series of bilateral or plurilateral or sectoral agreements in which the U.S. tries to achieve as much as it can on a country-by-country or a region-by-region or a sector-by-sector basis. The bill sets out criteria or a negotiating mandate for both of those scenarios. In terms of the multilateral negotiations, what, for example, one might expect from a Copenhagen negotiation, what the bill says is that the United States' objectives should be, first of all, to reach an internationally binding agreement in which all major greenhouse gas emitting countries contribute, again, equitably to the reduction of greenhouse gases. To ensure that this international agreement either contains or does not prohibit the use of trade measures by any party to that agreement in order to deal with carbon leakage issues. And finally, to include in an international agreement remedies that would be used against any party to the agreement that fails to meet its obligations under that agreement. And here, presumably, the Congress is not anticipating U.S. noncompliance, but the compliance of other parties to the agreement. So that's the test, essentially, that the U.S. administration is set out to meet under Waxman-Markey in its negotiations under a Copenhagen-type agreement. If the international agreement fails that test, then the border adjustment measures essentially would come into place. It's in the application of those border adjustment measures to individual products as they cross the border that you get a sense of what a second Plan B negotiating scenario might look like for the United States. So if an importer of a particular product coming from an energy-intensive, trade-exposed sector wants to get that product into the United States under a scenario in which the U.S. fails to produce this international agreement that is equitable from its point of view, the importer of that product can show that its product is coming from a sector or from a country that meets certain standards. And two of those standards deal with a negotiating mandate that Waxman-Markey sets out under this kind of Plan B scenario. So the U.S. could enter into a negotiation with another country, and the result of that bilateral or plurilateral negotiation could be that that other country undertakes commitments that are as stringent as those that the United States undertakes. Under those circumstances, an importer of a product from that country could avoid the application of border adjustment measures to that product. So that's one possible scenario of a Plan B of negotiations with the U.S. Apparently, those were primarily anticipated between industrialized countries, that those countries would be expected to have entered into an agreement with commitments as stringent as those undertaken by the U.S. through its own domestic legislation. The second possibility is that the U.S. enters into a sectoral agreement with another country that with very ill-defined characteristics of what that sectoral agreement might look like, but nonetheless one imagines the U.S., for example, sitting down with a country like China and negotiating a set of standards that might apply to the energy efficiency or carbon intensity of steel. And if that bargain was struck to the U.S.'s satisfaction, then an importer of Chinese steel coming from the steel industry complying with that agreement would not face border adjustment measures as it crosses the border. So those are our two scenarios that the U.S.'s negotiating partners could kind of try to anticipate as what it is that the U.S. wants and what happens should the U.S. not get what it wants. The reaction to the proposed measures from the U.S. negotiating partners as they read Waxman-Markey has been probably quite predictably very negative. They don't like the idea of the U.S. setting these unilateral standards. They see the Plan A standards in terms of having a very high standard international environmental agreement coming out of Copenhagen as probably not achievable, and maybe even included in the legislation as being set up for the U.S. to fail in order to provide a justification as to why the U.S. must now use border adjustment measures because the international community was unable to agree an agreement that the U.S. considers to be equitable in its outcome. So they're reacting quite negatively to that. And China and India, in fact, have put forward proposals in the UFCCC negotiations, the climate change negotiations, that would actually have the Copenhagen Agreement prohibiting the use particularly by developed countries in this circumstance, of unilateral trade measures to achieve climate policy objectives. So they are actually now including in their negotiating position one of the provisions that Waxman-Markey requires to be in an international agreement in order for it to meet the standards of Waxman-Markey. So we are set up for a bit of a cognitive dissonance and certainly some negotiating dissonance there. Other reactions to this, well, you may have heard the President of France's announcement, not only that he wants to put in place household carbon taxes in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also that he would like to see border tax adjustments accompanying that. So he may be on board, at least with one aspect of the U.S. legislation, and willing to retaliate in kind. But for the most part, I would say that the reaction has been one in principle. It hasn't gotten into the details of Waxman-Markey. It's just an objection generally to the use of unilateral measures. The other thing that we can see coming out of the international response to the trade measures in Waxman-Markey is some sort of signal that it would be a good thing if, whether it's Congress or the U.S. administration, to articulate more clearly what exactly it is willing to put forward as part of the international negotiations. One thing that is positive from Waxman-Markey is that it actually contains within it a negotiating mandate, which gives some predictability as to where the U.S. might move next in terms of the international negotiations. And in the absence of that mandate, the State Department, frankly, has been able to contribute very little of substance so far in terms of the international negotiations. Now, that's a very positive spin on this kind of a contribution to the international dynamics. The other thing that has come out of it has been a very strong preference from countries about behind-the-border measures, the kind of output-based rebating that James described in his presentation, which helps to deal with the competitiveness concern, which I think off the floors of the negotiations in the corridors, all countries would concede that the U.S. and any other country putting in place a cap has genuine concerns about the impact of that cap on its economy, but a strong signal back that the best way of doing this, and you see this in terms of the Australian proposals for their legislation and other countries that are moving forward, is to deal with that issue with behind-the-border measures, using essentially subsidies, free allowances as the better way of making producers whole, at least for a transitional period, that are trying to deal with the costs of these kinds of provisions being put in place. So things are clearly heating up. This bill and its trade provisions are casting more wood on the fire in terms of potential friction. Sorry, I'm mixing metaphors here, between negotiators in the international climate change negotiations, and frankly set us up much more for a kind of a Plan B-like outcome than a Plan A outcome in terms of how Waxman-Markey is framing things. In other words, very unlikely that in Copenhagen that we'll have a multilateral agreement that meets the kinds of standards that the U.S. Congress or the U.S. House of Representatives has set out in Waxman-Markey. More likely that we'll be entering into some kind of bilateral or sectoral or plurilateral arrangements that seek to deal with these major issues that continue to cause friction between trading partners. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gary to talk about the relationship between these same measures and a different international policy-making process that's trying to grapple with these issues, and that's the World Trade Organization.
Thanks very much, and especially thanks to the Doris Duke Foundation for putting WRI and the Peterson Institute into this issue, which looks like being one of the big, perhaps the biggest trade issue of the next few years. I want to give special thanks to my colleague Jason Kim, who is here, who has worked with me over the past few years on these issues, as well as Steve Charnovitz, who was not able to be with us today. And I would like to mention that Sally James, who's here from the Cato Institute, has done a very fine policy brief, which you can find on their website on the trade dimensions. And two final mentions. Ambassador Clayton Yider put together a group of former USTRs and issued a statement which is quite good and well worth looking at on the trade dimensions. And he has emphasized that the day when the U.S. can legislate for the world has passed. And that's a pretty important consideration as we go forward. Today, I'm going to talk about the WTO and climate change and sort of options, and just give some headlines of options. Because of the time, I'll be quite brief and just look at the headlines. Let me mention that my colleagues Jeff Schott and Mira Fickling are going to be publishing a brief on what do we do within NAFTA, and regional arrangements for dealing with these issues could be quite important in the future, certainly starting with NAFTA. The full paper that Jason and I wrote is in the handout in case you're interested. So just going forward quite quickly, the UN FCC, which has been mentioned by Jake, it could act multilaterally. Our view is that it would be hard for this body, which is in any event composed of a lot of countries, 170 countries odd, something like that, to come forward with detailed rules on climate, given all the other difficult issues. They will reiterate some principles, but to translate the principles into standards that would govern or would allow an adjudication of legislation seems to us a pretty far reach at this stage, especially given the wide difference between that recent Indian statement and the United States. So let me pass on very quickly to the WTO. And the default approach in the WTO is clearly a case-by-case approach. I mean, that's how the WTO settles issues now. Let me emphasize that a part of the Werksman-Markey legislation, which both James and Jake referred to, which is we could say the behind-the-border measures, the subsidy, we could call them subsidy measures, offsets and so forth. By no means are they insulated from WTO surveillance. I mean, there's a whole code on subsidy measures in the WTO, and most of these measures fall within the code. But apart from whether these internal offsets or allowances output-based or however they might be based, there are a number of other issues within the WTO which have not been settled in the case history to date, which is not a very rich case history, maybe 6 to 10 cases at most, which have a bearing, and we outline some of the open issues there. It's a lot, and so if it's to be a case-by-case approach, there are a lot of cases which will be litigated in the years ahead. Many people in speaking to the Congress have, in advocating Waxman-Markey type legislation, or earlier Lieberman-Warner and other bills, have really emphasized Article 20, the General Exceptions Clause, and there's no doubt that climate legislation falls within subparagraphs B and G, or B or G, which I have not reproduced here, as being appropriate for general exceptions. But what the advocates tend to neglect is this language in the chapeau, which I've repeated up there, and in fact is almost replicated word for word by the UN FCCC in one of its earlier principles. And this language historically has been interpreted quite strictly by the WTO appellate body. Does that mean in the future it will be interpreted strictly? Well, nobody knows, but they have rejected many appeals to the general exception, not many, but 3-4 appeals to the General Exceptions Clause on the basis that it was unjustifiable discrimination, it was a disguised restriction, and so forth. So they haven't just given a pass on this. Turning further on the case-by-case approach, which I will repeat again, is the default option. Guidelines take a long time. As those who follow WTO cases know, big cases take 2, 3, 4 years even. So it could be a while before we got definitive appellate body rulings. And of course, these cases can sometimes get pretty contentious, and therefore they can be a distraction. I won't say a dominant distraction, but they can be a distraction from the climate change goal. And here, those last two bullets, I think, point to the dilemma which the appellate body will face if the case by case. I mean, it's this very narrow line between being too lenient in reading Article 20 or giving a pass to various forms of border measures on the ground that there was some negotiation or something that seemed to satisfy the WTO, and then opening the door to opportunistic protection. Those who have followed sanitary and phytosanitary rules and technical barriers to trade and so forth, and recall some of the cases in this area, there's a lot of room for opportunistic protection in these details, and nowhere in climate measures could there be quite a bit of opportunistic protection. But on the other hand, if it's too strict, one can imagine the NGO community and many others perhaps asking, what is the appellate body doing in this policy space? Now, another approach which we've floated in our book, the we being Steve Charnovitz and Jason Kim and myself, is a new code of like-minded countries, which could be done under Annex 4, or it could be a code outside the WTO. Of course, it would not apply to countries that do not subscribe to it, but if one could get major countries subscribing to it, even only a few at the beginning, that would be a good starting point. But of course, to maximize its effectiveness, it should include the 10 or so big emitters, and you can see the names there, and you know that's not an easy task. If they can't agree in the UN FCCC, why would they agree in the WTO? So maybe one starts with even a narrower group of very like-minded countries, the EU, US, Japan, Australia, Canada perhaps. But if we go down that route, then some developing countries, and perhaps led by India, might have their own code, and it could emphasize either the historical record or per capita levels as a reason for putting on trade barriers. And on that basis, you could put on a lot of trade barriers against imports from the United States and other developed countries. So then that leads to the possibility of an amendment or waiver, and WTO hands in this room, which is about everybody here, knows how difficult that is. So I just mention it and pass it over. There have been amendments or waivers in the past, but I think it's fair to say they've not been on as controversial an issue as climate change. So that brings me to the stick to your knitting approach, which is, WTO just stay away from this as far as it can. And this is, I would say, the current Director General's, the current approach of Director General Lamy is basically let's focus on environmental goods and services. That is an important area. There's a lot that can be done in terms of lowering barriers, and let's just put this other stuff to one side. So that could be the near-term WTO mandate, but doesn't deal with the longer term. Then the final slide I just want to put up quite just to wrap this up is essentially to endorse the approach, which is to a large extent built into Werksman Markey in terms of imports. It's not on the subsidy side or the export side, because that immediately would give the subsidies or the offsets, and so would Australia, and so does the EU. But maybe we could have a peace clause on import barriers, so that you have a period of time to go forward with prolonged negotiations. Now, there are disadvantages, because we do know other peace clauses in the past have not necessarily produced the negotiations that we wanted, and agriculture is the most recent one. And further, during the peace clause period, it has to be said that some countries might slack off in terms of their efforts on the environment, so that is a negative concern. But having said all that, I like the peace clause. Thank you very much.